It's a real joy and a privilege to be with you all here this morning on this second Sunday of Lent. Ardmore it's been my community of faith, the community of faith for my family for about 9 years now. And so I'm here as one of you all, albeit I'm in a different station here in our space this morning than I usually am. I'm usually seated over here to my left. So last week, Tyler, he started this sermon series that we're walking through in Lent together, and these stories from Luke's Gospel, following Jesus as we journey toward the cross. Last week, we followed Jesus into the wilderness, and today, on this second Sunday of Lent, we'll be following Jesus to the mountain. I love mountains, and no, that's not just a bumper sticker that you might see on the back of a Subaru in Asheville. Mountains are home for me. I grew up in the mountains in western North Carolina, as did many generations of my Scots-Irish ancestors who settled there. Something you might not know about me, though, that I also have been hiking the Appalachian Trail section by section for about the last 12 years. I get to spend about a week out there every summer, usually with some good friends of mine. I've logged about 900 miles so far, and I'm planning a trip again in May to get some more miles under my feet. These backpacking trips that I've been able to do, they're in many ways a welcome break from all the emails, the meetings, just the busyness of life in general. Over these last 12 years that I've been hiking in the mountains, I've summited and descended, I don't even know how many mountains at this point, I've lost track. All the thousands of feet of elevation gain and loss that I've covered. But I can say that every single time that I reach the top of a mountain, I've been glad to be finished with the climb. Where I can finally catch my breath and hopefully enjoy a view from the top. During my treks on the trail, I've experienced stunning sunsets and sunrises, time with close friends and solitude, cold and rain and heat and humidity, and even a few wild animal encounters, but I'll save those stories for another time. Just know this about me. Mountains are important places for me, places where I feel at home and most alive. In our passage from the 9th chapter of Luke that Becky read for us just a few moments ago, we encounter Jesus going to a mountain with 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, who are often seen as the inner circle within the 12. When you heard this text read aloud just a few minutes ago, you might have been thinking to yourself, hey, that sounds really familiar, like I've heard that recently. And we did, in fact, hear this same story told from Mark's Gospel a couple weeks ago on Transfiguration Sunday. And Kathy Gore Chapel, who was our preacher that week, shared from this same story from the Transfiguration. And even though we've heard it recently, I think it's a story worth revisiting today again, specifically for what it can teach us during this Lenten season. This story of the Transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain is clearly steeped in mystery. It's also one of the many stories that we encounter throughout Scripture where significant events happen on the top of mountains. In fact, the 2 other people that we have here in this passage that was read, who Luke identifies as Elijah and Moses, they each had their own mountaintop experiences with God. Of course, Moses met God on Mount Horeb to receive the commandments, and also stood on Mount Nebo to finally view the promised land. And as many of you can also remember, Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, and another time stood on the mountain waiting for God. And as he experienced a wind that split the rocks in two, an earthquake and a fire, he learns that God wasn't in any of these things, but in the sound of sheer silence. There are also times in the Gospels where mountains are the setting for significant events in Jesus' own life and ministry. We, of course, have Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, that we find in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, which is much at the core of Jesus' teaching. There's also the scene that we know from the Mount of Olives, where Jesus went to pray just before he was seized by the Romans. But let's not rush too quickly to that mountain, as we'll get there soon enough as we journey toward Holy Week together. Let's first follow Jesus to this mountain. So here in Luke 9, we find Jesus going to the mountain to pray, and Peter, James, and John are invited to follow him there. Quite often, though, we find Jesus going alone to pray. But interestingly enough, he invites these three disciples to join him this time. These three, like the others, they were willing to follow Jesus. They were willing to give up their lives and their livelihood as fishermen, to walk away from it all and follow Jesus. Of course, we know these things from their own stories of calling earlier in Luke's gospel. Now they're being called again by Jesus to follow him up this mountain, leaving behind the other 9 disciples, away from the crowds, to a high place, just so they could find maybe a bit more silence and commune with God in prayer. Or so, that's what they thought they were going to do. Just as they went to the mountain to pray on this occasion, we know that Jesus often withdrew, and this is just one more of those times. Making space for prayer is one of the things that we are also encouraged to do, especially during this season of Lent, to let go of things that we cling to and to make more room for prayer in our own lives and our own journey of following Jesus. Maybe you're already a person who has made prayer a daily part of your habit in your life, or maybe you're someone who really wants to make more room for prayer in your life. Lent, the season that we are in the midst of, is a great time to work on that spiritual discipline and to build that habit more deeply into your own faith journey. It could be learning new ways to pray, making more space for silence, or just being more intentional certain times of the day to pause, to voice your prayers to God. Likewise, many of us have chosen to give up something in this season of Lent, abstaining from things like eating meat, or doing without desserts, or caffeine, or taking a break from consuming social media, because removing these things in our lives can help us become more aware. They can help us to be reminded to pause and to pray, to have a moment of purposeful silence, or to reflect on God's presence with us, both in the mountains and in the valleys, in our own journey as followers of Jesus. This season in the life of the church is personally one of my favorites. Maybe it's because I tend to lean more toward the contemplative side of faith, and Lent makes room for these spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices that are much more contemplative in nature, ones that invite reflection and introspection. Engaging in a purposeful Lenten season can help us to slow down, hopefully find a chance to pray more, to listen more, and to fast from the things that have been distractions in our own lives. So let's get back to our passage for this morning and look again a moment at these disciples that followed Jesus to the mountain. Peter, James, and John, they thought they were going to the mountain just to pray with Jesus. But as the story continues, we see there was even more that they would experience, the likes of which they could possibly have never imagined. So what happens when they reach the top of the mountain with Jesus? Well, the text says that Jesus was in prayer, and his appearance and his face changed and his clothes became white. And then 2 men, who we know turn out to be Moses and Elijah, they were talking to him. What were they talking about? Is a question I would really love to know. We don't know exactly all of the details of that conversation, but we do know that they talked about Jesus on Exodus that he was about to complete in Jerusalem. And as people who know the rest of the story, this part is about to begin as they descend this mountain. So while all this is going on, what are Peter, James, and John doing? Well, they're sleeping. My gut reaction is to say, come on, guys, really? But honestly, we don't know what time of the day this is taking place. Could be the middle of the night. We don't know exactly how long they've been on the mountain, how tired they might have been from the climb. But when they awaken, they do become aware of what's going on. So I give them some grace here. What really does strike me, though, at this moment in the story is that Peter, James, and John, when they actually wake up to this radiant light, they are fully present in the moment because they realize pretty quickly that they're experiencing something mysterious, something miraculous, something awe-inspiring. Peter, who for me comes across as all in all the time, mostly because he has a pretty solid track record of being like this. He goes as far as to suggest that they just set up camp here. They build some dwelling places for Moses and Elijah and Jesus, because Peter wanted to be present and wanted to take part in what was happening for as long as possible. He wanted to stay there and just take it all in as long as it lasted. And I can appreciate Peter's desire in this moment to have this moment sort of last as long as it possibly could. This is something they had never experienced and probably never would again. This is a story where it seems that the veil between heaven and earth is extremely thin, where they can recognize God's presence with them. And in thinking about these thin places, these places that are transfiguration moments in our own lives, one writer says that they usually come to us as gifts. We may not experience them again, but we can't undo them. They're etched in our minds, and they color and add depth to everything that comes after them. And this was certainly the case with the transfiguration of Jesus. Being fully present during these 40 days of Lent is something that we should aim toward. There's always the temptation to just ignore this season and treat it as ordinary time, or even rush too quickly to Easter morning, but really slowing down and living in the present moment, becoming more aware of God's presence with us and within our world can help us appreciate even more the sacrifice of Jesus that we celebrate at the culmination of this Lenten season. I think one of the reasons in my own life that I've grown to love and appreciate this season of Lent is that it has a way of forcing me to slow down, to reflect, to make more room and space for silence, and even to find opportunities to connect with God in the beauty of creation around me. One of these such moments in my own life happened several years ago when I headed up in the very early hours of the morning to hike at Pilot Mountain. It was a crisp, cool morning, and because I was there earlier than most others who were headed that way that day, it was still very quiet. At the bottom of the mountain, I discovered it was fairly clear, and the visibility was good. But as I climbed to the top, I quickly discovered that the top of the mountain, the pinnacle, was all fogged in up there. The clouds had really just settled in and nestled at the top of the mountain there. And so I paused several times on my hike to take a few pictures of the trail that was just engulfed in this cloud and this fog. Jim Mabe was kind enough to include one of these pictures in the slide, so you may see that if you're walking through the halls here in our building, this picture that I took, so you can get sort of a better idea of what that looked like and what I've been describing. But I was able to spend some time on that short hike, sort of slowly and meditatively walking and reflecting in this setting on the mountain. And it reminded me of this story of the Transfiguration and how the glory of God settled as a cloud, and it was all-encompassing for these disciples who were gathered with Jesus there to experience this. It's what Peter, James, and John were experiencing. They found themselves engulfed in this cloud, and they became deeply aware of God. Then there was a voice in the cloud saying to them, "This is my Son, the chosen one. Listen to him." The voice of God here in the midst of the cloud calls the disciples to listen. They were in danger of being distracted by all that they were experiencing and witnessing, and they might have missed out on the meaning if they hadn't been listening closely. It's a call to them and a call to us to listen, to pay attention, to be aware. For many of us, it can be a real challenge to find times of silence in our own lives where we can listen closely and more intentionally to God. I know that this is true for me even in my own life. Lent, though, this season that we're in, it does give us an opportunity and an invitation to focus on things like silence and listening more than speaking, and introspection and looking closely at ourselves and listening to what God may be trying to teach us. Because following Jesus means listening to Jesus. Peter, James, and John were instructed to listen, and we too, as followers of Jesus here in this time and this place, should also listen. As a person who's an introvert, I'm naturally one who tends to be more comfortable with listening than speaking. But I know that this isn't the case for us all. For some of us, it may require a little more work. And so maybe this season of Lent is an opportunity for you to practice this discipline of silence and listening a bit more. Seek to find times or places where you can build more silence or at least less noise into your life. Maybe turn off the radio in the car when you're driving to or from work or school, or maybe you have time early in the morning at your kitchen table with a cup of coffee before anyone else in your house gets up. Maybe it's on the back porch in the evening as the sun is slowly setting. Maybe it's even on a trail. Wherever you can find those spaces and places, I encourage you to do so. Following Jesus to the mountain doesn't mean we get to the top of the mountain and just stay there. It means we follow Jesus back down the mountain as well. That we follow Him to the high places and to the low places and all the places in between. Following Jesus to the mountain means that sometimes we'll experience those thin places and feel the nearness of God. And following Jesus down the mountain will also mean that we'll have moments in the valleys of life where God's presence can seem to feel a bit distant. And just as Peter, James, and John were changed by their experience as observers of the Transfiguration, my hope for us all is that we will allow this season of Lent to change us in some way. And so my invitation to us as followers in the way of Jesus during this season is that we make an effort to carve out time for prayer and silence in these days. That we make an effort to be present and aware of God's presence with us in the mountains and the valleys of life that we are experiencing. And we listen and discern what new things God may be calling us to see or do as individuals and as a community of faith, as we demonstrate the love of God to those who live around the corner and those who live around the world. Amen and amen.